Hello everyone, we are Video Collaboration Group 3, and we are here to talk about the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal, which both took place in the Pacific Theater in 1942. So the Battle of Midway occurred in the Pacific Ocean around Midway Atoll, which is the furthest west portion of the Hawaiian archipelago, and it is a strategic location about halfway between the US and Japan. America used the base as an outpost and refueling station, and the airfields would prove to be very useful during the battle itself. The Japanese felt as though they could recreate their surprise attack's success on Pearl Harbor here at Midway, but US codebreakers were actually able to find out and deduce that there was an attack inbound, what day it would happen, and the size of the attack. They were able to figure out that Japan would be sending 4 aircraft carriers, and so America sent in 2 task forces, which amounted to 3 total aircraft carriers, which were the Yorktown, the Hornet, and the Enterprise. Japan sent in 4 aircraft carriers, the Kaga, the Akagi, the Hiryu, and the Soryu. For Japan, winning the battle would mean having a chance to attack Hawaii proper more often. They would have more land in the Pacific, a good refueling base halfway to America. But for the US, it was very important that they win this battle. They could actually cripple the Japanese fleet if they proved to be successful. They could switch the initiative back to the Allied side, meaning that we could advance further into Japanese-held territory instead of fighting a defensive war. And that is actually what wound up happening during the battle. Mostly American dive bombers were what did the damage. We were able to sink all 4 present Japanese aircraft carriers, although we did suffer the loss of the Yorktown. And from that, we were able to gain initiative, and that's one of the reasons why it's considered one of the most tactically decisive battles in naval warfare history. The fact that we were able to defeat an enemy that up till then had seemed fairly difficult, if not impossible, to repel. The Battle of Midway really did just shift around the way that America fought. After Midway, we were able to take a more offensive posture rather than defending our territories. And it's actually very interesting. One of the pilots of the Dauntless dive bombers is pictured there. Was actually following a destroyer which is broken off of the task force, the Japanese task force, to chase a submarine. And that Japanese destroyer actually led the dive bombers back to the fleet itself. And this was a carrier battle, and the airfield on Midway itself provided quite a bit of assistance to the carrier pilots that did the real damage. So as a consequence, Japan lost all of its 4 carriers that were present: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. There were around 3,000 Japanese casualties, and this is the beginning of the American control of the Pacific. Japanese lost significant naval forces and experienced pilots. America lost the aircraft carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond. There were around 300 American casualties, and it did secure a forward posture towards Japan, and we gained the upper hand in the naval war as well. So this really is seen by many people as the turning point of the Pacific. It was our first big naval victory. You could say the Coral Sea was a strategic victory, but our materiel losses were pretty severe there. And we decimated 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor as well.
Now, moving on, with the Japanese forces still reeling from their defeat at Midway, the Allies set their sights on maintaining their newfound advantage within the Pacific theater, and it ultimately culminated into Operation Watchtower, both serving as a means to establish a new forward base of operations and also to prevent Japanese disruption of Allied supply chains. This offensive objective, which became unofficially named Operation Shoestring for the weak planning and preparation that actually went into the assault, which occurred on August 7, 1942, it took place on Guadalcanal and the nearby islands within the Solomon Islands. The Allies landed a U.S. Marine division on the north side of Guadalcanal, which quickly overtook the airbase, later known as Henderson Field, and set up a southern defense perimeter. The Battle of Savo Island that resulted the next night was a swift defeat dealt to the Allied naval forces while they were transporting supplies. Soon thereafter, Admiral Fletcher moved his naval aircraft carriers that were stationed off the island for support due to rising fears of potential attacks from Japanese patrols in the area. This action left the Marines on the island without much aid, thus forcing them to survive off captured Japanese rations or basically whatever they can find. Over the course of the next few months, both sides began to bolster their presence as almost daily naval skirmishes occurred in the waters around the island. The dense vegetation on the island made rapid movement incredibly difficult and limited the availability of superior firepower for the Allies to launch any actual offensive beyond the positions they already held. Maintaining control of Henderson Field proved critical as dominance of airspace became paramount. The prolonged time in the air enabled aerial units on the island to assert this very dominance, later being known as the Cactus Air Force. Tensions began to reach a boiling point when Japanese forces launched an offensive on Henderson Field, but resulting from this little skirmish, they suffered heavy losses while the Allies maintained control of their position, and thus set the tone for the remainder of the battle that ensued on this island.
The results and consequences of the Battle of Guadalcanal. The Allies had some casualties, but nothing compared to the Japanese. The Japanese had around 24,000 casualties, and the Allies had around 1,600 casualties, and with 4,200 injured. Again, it's notice how many casualties there were on the side of the Japanese forces. It just comes to show the Banzai mentality, how the Japanese were not willing to give up without a fight, and they would just continue thereafter, even after beyond the Battle of Guadalcanal. Again, there would be a lot more Japanese casualties. Ship losses were heavy on both sides, much more on Japanese side. American codebreakers gave Allies the upper hand. So basically, thanks to the hard work of the American codebreakers, the Allies had the upper hand by having knowledge of where Japanese strategies would ensue, thus be able to counterattack. Just like in the Battle of Midway, the Japanese lost a lot more elite naval aviators. Again, it just comes to show how the Japanese were so tenacious in fighting. Due to winning the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Allies established air superiority over Japan. The Allies now had the upper hand in air superiority when it came to battles. Guadalcanal also was able to be established as an air base for the Allies. It was a strategic warfare positioning for the oncoming battles that were going to ensue in the Pacific. It also enabled Allied communication. The end result, Japan unable to withstand counteroffensive attacks either by air or by sea. It was the beginning of the end for Japan. With the Battle of Midway and with the Battle of Guadalcanal both lost, the Japanese knew that it was the beginning of the end, and they knew they had no other chance to be able to successfully counterattack the Allies, and the Allies just had everything on their hand to be able to fully defeat and destroy the Japanese.